The first thing people remembered was the smell. Not smoke exactly, but something older and heavier, like wet ash mixed with iron and rot. Bones crackled in the fire as if they were still alive, releasing thin screams that didn't come from throats but from memory itself. When the house finally collapsed, its beams folding inward like broken ribs, the forest did not react. No birds fled, no animals stirred. It was as if the land had been waiting for this ending, holding its breath for decades. Those who stood watching felt an instinctive terror, not because something was dying, but because something had already lived there far too long. Long before the flames, long before anyone dared speak of what happened, the ground beneath that house had learned the weight of secrets. Children cried beneath floorboards that were never meant to hear them. Bloodlines folded inward until names lost meaning. Love curdled into something experimental, deliberate and cold. By the time the truth surfaced, it did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as confirmation of a dread everyone had felt but never named. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The records say Oregon, early 20th century. The maps from that era barely acknowledge the place. A cluster of ink marks near Crater Lake, surrounded by dense green shading meant to indicate forest so thick it resisted settlement. Back then, the land wasn't scenic, it was hostile. Pine trunks rose like pillars in a ruined cathedral, and fog clung low to the ground, swallowing sound. People built homes there not because it was safe, but because it was empty. And emptiness has a way of attracting those who want to disappear. The house stood just beyond what passed for a road, its foundation sunk deep into dark soil that never fully thawed. From the outside it looked ordinary. Squared timber, a pitched roof, smoke that rose too straight, even on days when the wind bent the trees sideways. Locals noticed that detail first. They also noticed how quiet it was around the property. No dogs barked, no livestock wandered close. Even insects seemed to avoid the place, as if something in the air warned them away. Inside lived a family that did not invite visitors, a father who spoke little, children who spoke even less. The town whispered about grief, about a mother who died bringing life into the world and took something essential with her when she left it. Isolation followed naturally. In places like that, solitude was common. What was uncommon was the way the children watched people, not with curiosity but with recognition, as though they were studying a species they no longer belonged to. Years passed. Seasons layered themselves over the house like sediment. Snow muffled sound, summer heat rotted wood, and inside something was growing that did not require sunlight or approval. It fed on closeness, on sameness, on the absence of witnesses. The forest kept its silence, and the town learned to do the same, because some families were better left alone, not out of respect, out of fear. The fear came first, understanding would come much later. The father's name appears only sporadically in county ledgers, written in a careful hand that suggested a man trying to anchor himself to paper. He owned the land outright, paid in full, no liens, no questions. After his wife's death, he stopped attending church, stopped bringing the children into town except when supplies demanded it. People noticed the change slowly, the way rot spreads through a beam before the surface gives way. He was thinner, quieter, as if grief had hollowed him out and left only routine behind. The children were twins, born minutes apart on a night when the midwife later claimed the wind had screamed like a living thing. One boy, one girl, identical in pallor, in posture, in the way their eyes lingered too long on details others ignored. They did not cry much as infants. They watched. As they grew, they learned words late and abandoned them early, preferring glances and gestures that passed meaning without sound. Townsfolk told themselves it was shyness, isolation, the natural result of growing up so far from others. But even then, there was unease. By the time they were old enough to walk the property alone, people began to remark on how rarely they were seen apart. If one appeared at a window, the other stood just behind, close enough that their shadows merged on the glass. They moved through rooms like reflections trapped in separate mirrors. When spoken to individually, they hesitated, as if listening for an answer that came from somewhere else. Their father dismissed concerns with tired smiles. He said they had always been close. He said loss does that to children. The house itself seemed to adapt to them. Floors creaked less beneath their steps, doors closed without slamming. It was as if the structure recognized their rhythm and learned to accommodate it. They spent hours in the attic where their grandfather's books had been left to decay. Old volumes on breeding livestock, on lineage, on the careful selection of traits to produce desired outcomes. Marginal notes filled the pages in two identical scripts, one slanting slightly left, the other right, converging on the same conclusions. Animals were the first to suffer. Chickens born with twisted legs, a calf that could not stand. These were dismissed as accidents, the cost of frontier life. But the twins watched closely. Recording details in small notebooks they hid beneath loose floorboards. They spoke of patterns, of repetition, of how nature rewarded those who paid attention. When a litter of kittens produced one blind runt, the girl cradled it with reverence while the boy observed its decline with clinical focus. Their father did not see this. Or if he did, he told himself it was harmless curiosity. As adolescence crept in, the boundaries that separated them from the world thinned further. They stopped seeking permission. They stopped acknowledging their father's authority except when it suited them. At night, lights burned in the upper rooms long after the rest of the house slept. Sometimes voices carried through the walls, low and intimate, arguing not like siblings but like collaborators refining a shared idea. The forest listened. The house held its breath. Something was being prepared. Not suddenly, patiently, like a seed planted deep enough that no one would notice until the roots had already split the foundation. The first sign that something had shifted came not from the house, but from the town. A shopkeeper mentioned that the girl had come in alone, her hands trembling as she laid coins on the counter for white cloth and candle wax. She said it was for a family rite. Her voice was steady, practiced, as if she had rehearsed the explanation. When asked who would attend, she smiled faintly and said only, "We will." The shopkeeper laughed it off at the time, but later the memory returned with a weight that made his stomach turn. When their father confronted them, it was not with anger at first, but confusion. He asked what ceremony they were preparing for. He asked why they needed locks for interior doors, why the attic had been cleared of everything but a table and two chairs facing each other. They answered him calmly, without defensiveness. They said they had reached an understanding. They said the books had clarified what the world refused to see. Blood, they explained, was not merely inheritance, it was instruction, and theirs had always spoken in unison. The night they told him of their decision, rain pressed against the windows like listening ears. They sat close together, knees touching, hands folded in identical positions. They said they would not marry outsiders, that dilution was decay, that their bond was complete, unbroken by difference or doubt. When he shouted, they waited. When he prayed, they watched. When he begged, they exchanged a look that passed something final between them. By morning, he understood that the argument was over. There was no minister, no license filed, only a private ritual behind the house where the ground sloped toward the trees. The father stood apart, holding a Bible that shook in his hands. The twins spoke vows they had written themselves, words about unity and continuation and purpose. When they joined hands, the forest went still. Later, the father would swear that even the insects had stopped singing, as if the land itself recoiled from what it witnessed. After that, the house changed. Windows were boarded, curtains drawn thick enough to swallow light. Rooms were reassigned, walls reinforced. The twins moved through the space with ownership, not permission. Their father retreated inward, taking refuge in work and drink, avoiding the upper floors where their footsteps moved in tandem. At night he heard murmurs through the ceiling, conversations that rose and fell like breathing. The first pregnancy was announced without ceremony. The girl spoke of it as a milestone, not a miracle. The boy recorded dates, measurements, symptoms. They treated the body as a site of observation. When the child was born, wrong in ways that defied polite language, they did not weep, they studied. Fingers company, untid, skull measured. They whispered about outcomes and variables while their father fled the room, gagging on horror and guilt. That was when the cellar door was first reinforced, when lime was ordered in bulk, when the cries began to sound less like infants and more like something struggling to become one. The house absorbed it all, its beams darkening, its floors learning new rhythms. Outside, the town sensed a change it could not name. People avoided the road that passed the property. They crossed themselves without knowing why. Inside, the twins were no longer pretending to be a family. They were building one, piece by piece, according to rules only they believed in. As seasons turned, the pregnancies followed one another with unnatural precision. There was no celebration, no marking of time beyond notes in ledgers kept hidden beneath the floor. Each birth was treated as a trial. Some infants lived only hours, their bodies removed quietly before dawn. Others survived, altered in ways that made the father avert his eyes. Limbs twisted, features collapsed inward, eyes that did not focus on faces but on light and movement like those of animals. The twins responded to each outcome with the same measured calm, adjusting their methods, refining their approach. They began using symbols, chalk markings on basement walls, patterns carved into wooden beams, circles intersecting lines, annotated with dates and names that never appeared in any public record. The father stumbled upon them once, his lantern shaking as he descended the steps. He asked what they meant. The twins answered without looking up, explaining that repetition revealed truth, that failure was merely information. When he threatened to leave, they reminded him quietly that no one would believe him. Isolation had done its work too well. At night, the screams started to change. They were no longer constant, but rhythmic, rising and falling like some perverse lullaby. Sometimes they stopped abruptly, replaced by scratching, by the dull thud of movement beneath the floor. Neighbors reported hearing it when the wind was right, a sound like a child calling from underground. When asked, the twins said it was the house settling. Old foundations made strange noises. Most people accepted the explanation. Frontier homes were full of ghosts, real or imagined. Animals avoided the property entirely now. Deer paths curved away from the fence line. Birds nested elsewhere. A hunter once found a mutilated fox near the tree line, its body marked with cuts too deliberate to be the work of predators. He brought it to town, but no one wanted to claim responsibility for asking questions. Curiosity had become dangerous. Silence felt safer. Inside, the children who survived were kept below. The twins said sunlight distracted them, that darkness preserved consistency. The father heard small feet pacing, heard whispers that were not taught but learned through suffering. One night, a voice reached him through a vent beneath his bed. It was thin, hoarse, barely formed. It asked for help. He pressed his hands over his ears and prayed until morning, knowing prayer was no longer enough. The twins spoke less to each other now, relying on notes and glances. Their unity had hardened into efficiency. They no longer needed words. When the boy disappeared from the house for hours at a time, returning with stained sleeves and the smell of earth, the father did not ask where he had been. He already knew. Shallow graves marked the failures, placed carefully so the soil would not betray them too quickly. The town began to whisper of curses, of sin that poisoned the land. A few suggested burning the house, ending whatever was happening before it spread, but no one wanted to be the first to act. Responsibility, like guilt, was easier to share than to claim. And so the house remained, its cellar filling with lives reduced to variables, its walls absorbing cries until they sounded like part of the wind. By the time outsiders started to vanish, it was already too late. The foundation had been laid, not just in wood and stone, but in years of deliberate cruelty, refined into routine. What was happening beneath that house was no longer an aberration. It was a system, and systems, once established, resist interruption with surprising violence. The truth did not emerge all at once. It surfaced in fragments, carried by fear, stitched together by disappearance. A hunter failed to return from a routine trip. A doctor's carriage was found abandoned, horses wide-eyed and trembling, as if they had seen something that stripped instinct bare. Each absence traced a loose circle around the same stretch of forest, around the same house. People began to count days instead of names, measuring how long it had been since anyone dared approach the place openly. It was a hunter who came closest to naming it. He had been invited inside under the pretense of trade, offered coffee that went untouched. He noticed the locks first, then the smell, sharp and metallic beneath the bitter scent of boiled grounds. He heard a cry beneath his boots, faint but unmistakable. When he asked about it, the twins' faces changed in perfect unison. Calm hardened into something watchful. The girl said it was the wind. The boy rested his hand near his rifle. The hunter left with his skin crawling, certain he had walked out of a place where the rules no longer applied. He was never seen again. The town began to whisper what it had avoided for years. Not madness, not curse, blood. Someone recalled the twins' closeness as children, the way they moved as one long before they had words for what they were becoming. Another remembered the old books carried home from the attic, volumes on breeding and inheritance. Slowly, reluctantly, the idea took shape. The children were not simply isolated, they were folded inward. Brother and sister, husband and wife. Parents to children conceived in defiance of every boundary meant to separate care from harm. When the sheriff finally acted, the house seemed to be waiting. The twins stood on the porch as if summoned, faces pale, eyes clear. They did not deny the accusation, they explained it. Blood should not be scattered, they said. Family trees weakened when they reached outward. Strength came from returning to the source, from keeping lines unbroken. As they spoke, it became clear that they did not see their actions as taboo. They saw them as correction, as refinement. Inside, the evidence removed any doubt. Charts mapped generations that folded back on themselves, names repeating until lineage became a closed loop. Notes described each child as outcome rather than person. Successes were marked, failures crossed out. The children themselves were found below, some alive, some reduced to remains wrapped carefully in cloth. They bore the physical truth of the twins' philosophy, bodies shaped by a union that consumed itself. The town did not know how to respond. Shame spread as quickly as anger. How long had they suspected? How long had they chosen not to see? That night, voices gathered near the property, prayers mixing with threats. Some spoke of burning the house, of erasing the stain before it seeped any deeper into the land. Others wanted silence, records destroyed, the story buried alongside the dead. The church bells rang, not in warning, but in mourning. By morning, the decision had been made without ever being spoken aloud. Whatever had been allowed to grow there would not be permitted to leave roots behind. The house would not stand much longer, and neither would the illusion that the town had been innocent in its making. Fire came at dawn, carried not by lightning but by hands that trembled with purpose. No one recorded who struck the match. No one claimed responsibility. It was understood as necessity rather than choice. The flames climbed quickly, fed by dried timber and years of sealed air. As the roof collapsed, sparks drifted into the trees, briefly illuminating faces etched with fear and relief in equal measure. Some people prayed, others watched in silence, knowing that destruction was easier than confession. Animals were driven off or killed outright, as if contagion could move through fur and bone. Papers were torn, ledgers burned, family records erased in hurried attempts to sever the past from the present. The twins were taken away under guard, their expressions unchanged, as if removal from the house was merely a change of setting. They did not look back when the walls fell. They had already memorized what mattered. In the weeks that followed, the town closed inward. Outsiders were discouraged. Questions went unanswered. The children who survived were moved quietly, their conditions described in euphemisms that softened nothing. Ministers spoke of collective sin, of how communities could become accomplices through inaction, but sermons could not unhear the sounds that lingered in memory, the cries that rose from beneath the earth long after the cellar had been reduced to ash. Years passed. The forest reclaimed the site, moss creeping over blackened stone, roots threading through what remained of the foundation. People avoided the area instinctively. Even those who denied belief in curses admitted that the ground felt wrong, as if it remembered being violated. Children were warned away without explanation. Silence became tradition. Decades later, when records were revisited by me only too young to remember the fire, the gaps were impossible to ignore. Births unregistered, deaths without certificates, a family tree that ended abruptly, as if cut with a blade. In the 1980s, a researcher traced those absences back to Oregon, following marginal notes and half-burned documents preserved in a courthouse basement. What they found were photographs never meant to be kept. Images of children whose eyes did not reflect the camera, whose bodies bore the cost of an idea pursued without restraint. Audio tapes followed. Interviews with townspeople who spoke in lowered voices even decades later. They described the twins not as monsters, but as methodical, calm, certain. One elderly man admitted that he had known something was wrong when he heard crying at night and chose to call it wind. He said the sound followed him into old age, rising in his dreams whenever the world went quiet. The researcher published cautiously, aware that exposing the full truth would reopen wounds no one had learned to heal. Still, the story surfaced, fragmented but intact enough to disturb. It was no longer just a local legend. It was a record of what happens when isolation meets obsession, and no one intervenes. The past, once buried, had begun to breathe again, and with it came an uncomfortable question, one that lingered beneath every document and testimony. How much of what happened belonged to the twins alone, and how much belonged to everyone who looked away? The deeper the researcher went, the more the story resisted being confined to paper. Every document felt like a fragment torn from something still alive. In a university archive, tucked between agricultural reports and census ledgers, they found a thin envelope marked only with a date. Inside were photographs taken by a county official shortly after the fire. The images were grainy, the edges warped by heat. But the objects were unmistakable. Children standing barefoot on concrete floors, limbs bent at angles that suggested years of neglect rather than sudden injury. Eyes that did not plead, because pleading had never worked. One photograph showed a wall covered in chalk markings, circles intersecting circles, annotated with symbols that echoed those found in old breeding manuals. The researcher recognized the pattern immediately. It was not ritual in the religious sense. It was methodology, a visual language used to track outcomes across generations, to map deterioration and persistence. The twins had been building a closed system, one that fed on itself and produced data until the data could no longer be separated from suffering. There were tapes as well, recorded in the late 1980s by a journalist who never finished the project. On them, former residents spoke hesitantly, their voices cracking as they recalled details they had buried for half a lifetime. One woman described seeing the girl twin years after the arrest, seated behind glass during a prison visit. She said the woman's hair had gone grey early, her posture rigid, her eyes still sharp. She looked at me like I was the one being examined, the woman whispered into the recorder, like she was still waiting for results. Another tape captured the voice of a retired nurse who had briefly cared for two of the surviving children. She spoke of how they reacted to touch, flinching or freezing, unsure whether contact meant comfort or pain. One child would rock for hours, humming a tuneless sound that matched the rhythm of the cries once heard beneath the house. They weren't feral, the nurse said. They were trained, conditioned. They learned early that noise brought attention and attention brought consequences. The researcher followed the paper trail further, uncovering letters written by the male twin from prison. They were lucid, articulate, devoid of remorse. He spoke of heredity as destiny, of how society feared truths it wasn't ready to confront. In one letter, he requested that his body be studied after death, as if he himself were the final specimen. The request was denied, but the intent lingered like a stain. Even caged, he saw himself as a contributor to knowledge rather than its warning. As the work neared publication, the researcher hesitated. To tell the story fully meant confronting the idea that the horror had not been sudden or hidden. It had been gradual, visible, tolerated. The house had not existed in isolation. It had been surrounded by people who sensed something wrong and chose distance over action. The story was not just about twins who crossed a boundary. It was about how that boundary eroded while everyone watched it thin, and once that understanding settled in, the documents no longer felt historical. They felt present, uncomfortably so. The final files were the hardest to read. They were not sensational, not graphic, but quiet in a way that made the researcher pause after every page. Institutional summaries, medical updates, sparse notes written by overworked staff who did not have the language for what they were seeing. The surviving children were listed not by family name, but by initials, as if even identity had been considered dangerous. Progress was measured in inches, not milestones. A first word spoken at age 12, a night without screaming recorded as an achievement. One girl never learned to speak at all. She communicated through pressure, pressing her forehead against walls or hands, seeking resistance rather than comfort. The boy who lived the longest rocked until his spine curved permanently, his body folding inward as if trying to return to a shape that felt safer. Doctors used terms like developmental delay and congenital defect, but those words felt insufficient. The damage had not begun in the womb alone. It had been reinforced every day afterward, taught and retaught until it became instinct. The father's records ended abruptly. Found in the attic during the search, malnourished and disoriented, he spent his final years in an asylum, repeating the same phrases over and over. He spoke of voices beneath the floor, of counting footsteps at night, of a house that listened. When he died, no one claimed the body. He was buried without ceremony, another name dissolved into the soil. The twins themselves aged behind bars, separated physically but never mentally. Prison doctors noted their continued fixation on heredity, on patterns that others failed to see. The woman died first, still convinced that history would eventually vindicate her. The man lived longer, his mind sharp until the end. His final request, that his remains be studied, was denied once again. When his ashes were scattered far from Oregon, some claimed the wind shifted unnaturally, carrying them away from the land that had rejected him. The house never returned. Trees grew where it had stood, their trunks twisted, their roots tangled through charred stone. Hikers reported a strange stillness in that part of the forest, a sense that sound did not travel correctly there. Some claimed to hear faint movement beneath their feet, a rhythm that echoed old cries. Others felt nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. What remained was not a haunting, but a memory embedded in place, a warning written into the landscape itself. The story did not persist because it was supernatural. It persisted because it was human, because it showed how easily curiosity could become justification, how love could be rewritten as ownership, how silence could become complicity. So the question lingers, long after the records end and the ashes cool. What would you do if you learned that the person who raised you was also the person who trapped you inside a closed circle of blood and belief? If the truth of your origin was not just painful but engineered? The forest offers no answer. It only stands patient and unjudging, holding the imprint of what happened when no one stopped it. And in that stillness, the story continues to breathe, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of what waits in the dark when the world decides not to look.